Welcome back, everyone. And today, if you couldn't tell already, we're going to be talking about my review of the core rulebook for Candela Obscura, coming out just last week from Darrington Press. If you're not familiar, they're the company started by Critical Role for the production of their own TTRPGs, this one using the Illuminated Worlds system. Now, I do know that some people are a little concerned with how close it's similar to the Powered by the Apocalypse system, but after reviewing the book and reading all the way through it, which was actually not as hard as I thought it would be. I would honestly say there's not too much. Maybe inspired rules, sure, but the system definitely works differently, and I'll go through that through the video. But today's video is mostly just going to be about me explaining to you guys what Candela Obscura is, the general themes of the game, how the game works, what characters are like, and as well what you can experience if you decide yourself to purchase the game. So that being the case, let's go ahead and get started. So Candela Obscura is what you would call a horror TTRPG, which that's a strange way to put it because I know the hard part is, right, is what exactly is a horror TTRPG? It's not like TTRPGs can be any more or less scary depending on the style of narrative. It's mostly just based on the themes, and the themes of this game is based on horrifying things, with the book illustrating so many great and beautiful pieces of art and all kinds of extra stuff. As you can see here with the image behind me, you have this image of a man who looks stressed, worried, along with some kind of arcane or archaic symbol and notes, like handwritten notes on torn pieces of paper. That is the general feeling. If you're familiar with horror games in general, they're always about the esoteric and the horror, more about the unknown rather than the known. Everything is always very sporadic and hasty, ripped notes, and always has some kind of weird connection to the eldritch or arcane, and this system is no different. Now, the general setting for this game is set in a setting similar to our own. In the early 2000s level of technology, there is electricity, there is, cars and various objects, but the world, in addition to that, has, well, a secret world, a secret world connected to the magics. So magic with a CK, because we're quirky like that here, is more like a force similar to electricity. It can be fused into mundane objects or places or even people or other types of beings to create different effects. Now, objects that have, for instance, magic put into them are known as artifacts, while certain like beings with magic or places affected by magic are known as phenomenon. Now, magic is inherently risky and a overall corrupting force, similar to how you might consider radiation. There's this effect called bleed that you can see up here that essentially corrupts people, and bleed is actually a type of damage a character can take in the game, something that corrupts their body and changes it irrevocably. In addition, people who actively utilize magic is very rare. And in fact, even though this system does have a weird role, which is a style of class, or more like an archetype of class, I'll get to that part in a little bit. Their control of magic is not very direct, and oftentimes is nothing so overt. For instance, very typically, they're not capable of just whipping around fireballs or creating walls of earth or whatever all willy nilly. There are a variety of things that need to take place first before some similar events can take place, typically through the use of artifacts. The players operate as members of the organization that goes under the same namesake of the game, which is Candela Obscura. They're led by a light keeper who is an NPC who kind of operates as your go-to man, your your point of contact for the organization, and you are kind of a part of a chapter, which is a smaller part of the organization. And even yet, you're part of a circle, which is the player group, and your circle operates within a chapter, which is a part of Candela Obscura. Now, I kind of reference this, or I kind of referenced the magics of the world, but how they come across is there's kind of this split between the normal world and the magic world, more or less. This is called the flare, or this game's version of the veil. And a when it thins, or it's called the thinning in this game, you get access to essentially a different dimension where a lot of this kind of stuff happens. Now, the general populace does not know anything about the veil, or sorry, the flare, or bleed, or anything supernatural. That is purely, kept in check by the government, other organizations, but also Candela Obscura. And thus, you have access to the fourth Pharos, which is a variety of locations inside the flare, on the other side, in the beyond, that has all of the mystical tomes, vaults, artifacts, whatever you're looking for in it. And Candela Obscura kind of operates as this force that is meant to keep the world safe and secure from the supernatural. So when it comes to the players, what you're overall capable of doing is made up of mostly two parts. Well, three parts, but two parts in the sense of there's drives and actions, which this is the overall what your characters are capable of. A drive is kind of the overall category, as you can see here on the side. We have like cunning, for instance, as sway, read, hide, or we have nerve that has move, strike, control. And the three drives over here pretty much relate to physical types, mental types like calculation, or anything that recalling information, and kind of like wisdom types, which is cunning, which is your character's overall ability to use things like charisma to sway someone, for instance, or be able to read a room, or be able to know how to hide or obfuscate your actions, more or less. It's not a perfect set of actions, I have to admit, and you could probably barely see here. 1 second. But you can see here that there are a list of types of actions. For instance, under move, up here at the top, we have run, dodge, navigate. Essentially, move is anything related to an action that moves your character's body, while strike is anything your character does to either, and it doesn't say grapple, which it says in a different section there, but it's kind of your character's attack actions, more or less. And then control mostly relates to things that require more high dexterity, like driving, shooting, anything that requires a level of finesse. And each of these actions over here have a set of dots. And at any point, you can only have 3 dots in a skill. And this kind of relates to how the dice system works. And your drives have 3 categories of 3 that you can utilize as a resource, more or less. So let's kind of break this down so you guys can understand the general like dice system. So whenever a character makes an action roll, which is essentially a skill check by most other system standards, they collect a dice pool. The dice pool uses a number of dice from the action, which I showed you before, and then you can give extra dice using your drives over here. So spending a drive point essentially will add a dice to the pool, making it so that you can have a max dice pool of 6 dice. Your drives are an expendable resource that you can utilize during an assignment and do not refresh until you're done with an assignment. Assignments being the general like mission your characters go on. And when you go on a mission, of course, once you use one of your drive points, you can't do it for the rest of that mission. So after the mission, you can, and we'll get to this a little later, spend a special resource to get those drive points back. So you can add dice to checks, and there's no specific limit or way you can do this. In fact, you can spend drive on actions that you have no points in, meaning that the whole dice pool is created specifically of your drive points spent. Now, overall, in the way I view this game is it's meant to be like done in one shots, or one shots. About 1 to 2 sessions, maybe, 3 to 6 hours, depending on how your group rolls. So the use of these points is something that's quite major, as it might be, multiple sessions depending on the type of assignment you go on. It's really based on the type of story your GM is trying to tell, but predominantly it's supposed to be like per session or per every other session. You're supposed to be getting these points back, give or take. There's actually some stipulations to this. So typically you're looking at the use of, 1 to 3 dice on a check. But what does that mean? Well, you use D6s. And these D6s you roll and you take the highest result of dice that you roll. Now, if it's a result of 1 through 3, it's considered a miss and you fail to do whatever the action is, and you might suffer consequences, which we'll get to here in a little bit. If it's a 4 or 5, it's a mixed result, which means you do succeed, but there is some minor consequence or maybe even more substantial, depending on the stake of the roll, which is something else we'll get to. And if you roll a 6, you get a full success with no negative drawbacks. Now, there is also critical successes, which can give you something extra if you roll multiple 6s on the dice. So overall, this system is based on getting a dice pool big enough so that you have a higher chance of making a bigger roll. Now, of course, this works out into your general favor, as the more dice you throw into the pool, the higher your general average will be on the results of the dice, being that you're likely to get 3 to 4 on most of your attempts. Now, 3 is a failure and 4 is still a mixed success. So you might want to, get as many dice as possible to at least increase the chances that you're going to get higher dice. Obviously, averages include both lows and highs after all. So, that being the case, using your drives is something necessary when you deem it necessary to succeed a check. And this is actually where we're going to go into the stakes. So, stakes come in 3 levels of essentially risk: low risk, standard risk, and high risk. Now, most rolls that you will take will be in the standard category of stakes, which is something negative might happen on a mixed success, or probably will happen on a mixed success, but it's not going to necessarily kill your character. That would be a high stake, for instance. Low stakes are very uncommon, but they might be something representative of adding some spice to the moment. Regardless, you have to, the expectation for the roll has to be made, which is actually going to be this next part here. So whenever a dice roll is essentially concocted by the GM will lay out the expectations for the roll. This is something that is determined by the stake. So the GM will say, like, okay, you want to pick the lock. Well, you're doing this in a high stress situation. The guards might be coming at any time. So I'm going to make this a standard stake, as if you get found, you'll need to act quickly if you don't want your identities to be revealed. So this is the expectation. But there's also the conversation. If the player determines that they want to do a course of actions, it's up to both the player and the GM to hash out what the expectations are and what the stakes are. This might allow the player to change their course of action. They give an example here, but I'll give you an even easier one. For instance, a player might be in a high-speed chase on the road and they want to make a control check to drive off of the back of like a empty semi truck, for instance, onto a higher road to get away from like the police or something. This sounds like a really fun and high action kind of scene, but the GM might, dictate that, okay, but this makes it a high stakes roll, because if you fail, there's a chance that you could do severe injury to yourself or people around you. That this is where the conversation takes place, where the player maybe not expecting to have such severe results might choose another course of action of escaping the police. So, that being the case, the overall role is dictated by both the GM and the player based on what kind of action the player wants to make, and then a stake is set and the roll is made. The roll using the dice pool, but there's actually an additional mechanic. Gilded dice are unique dice that you use. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but essentially your player dice pool should have 9 total dice. 6 standard dice, which can represent the maximum number of dice you can make on a roll, and 3 differently colored gilded dice that are easy to separate from your other dice that can do special actions. Predominantly, though, what they're utilized for is refreshing your drive. Now, I did say before that drive is not refilled unless it's between missions, but that wasn't 100% true if you have gilded dice for whatever actions. Now, each player typically will only have access to one of their actions. Like you can see on the sheet over here, that this one has move with a little diamond filled next to it. That means whenever they roll move, they replace one of their dice with a gilded die. Now, they can opt to take the result of a gilded die instead of what could be a higher roll on a standard die, opting to take a mixed success rather than a full success because it helps them recover a point of drive. This gives the player a way to essentially negotiate their points during the course of an action when they're using actions that their character is overall designed to be especially good at. This creates an interesting point where the players can keep up their drive over the course of a mission by doing things that they are overly focused on. But I do feel like this will also make players very prone to pushing gilded actions as much as possible. Also, there's a different way that you can gain gilded dice through character abilities. But let's talk about character abilities, shall we? So, this comes from the overall role and specialty of your character. So, Candela Obscura separates players and individual characters by their role, which you can see here, the face, muscle, scholar, slink, and weird, and their specialty, which is a much more focused version of a role, which you can find here in the parentheses, like the journalist, magician, explorer, soldier, doctor, professor, criminal, detective, medium, or occultist. Now, your overall role determines what your character wants to do. For instance, the face has actions that are much more dedicated towards the manipulation, or it says here, mastery of people, while muscle oftentimes focuses on actions dedicated to moving or using one's body. Now, it can be kind of viewed that many of these focus on a particular category of drive. For instance, muscle is very clearly for nerve, but some of them kind of have actions that go in between. The face, for instance, has a little bit of cunning, as you can see here above me. They might have some sway to talk people over, or maybe read to gain a general sense of the situation. But they also might have points in like survey or to sense, depending on to help them like investigate. So as you can see here, for instance, as we look at the roll slink, we have these beautiful tarot style of cards that have the name of the specialty, and then we have both the criminal and the detective, two faces of the same coin when it comes to overall skill sets. The criminal, for instance, here is someone who primarily is use their cunning as their primary drive, and they have focused on their street connections or the ability to use nefarious actions, while and we have the dapper detective here, who is much more focused on nerve, which allows them to, I guess, have more finite control. This one is actually very weird to me, as you'd figure it'd be more based on their scholarly abilities, for instance. But it says your abilities are focused on uncovering the truth and stopping malefactors. So, yeah, the art in this book is absolutely amazing, and the characters always have this very strong sense. It's funny because it says a lot of the setting is like your own setting, similar to the world you're currently in, even though much of the art and many of the characters here represent more like late 1800 styles of characters. Now, when you select both your main role and your specialty, you select from the specialty list for your first 5 action points. You can see here, like the journalist, for instance, gets a point in read, a point in or 2 points in survey, 1 point in focus, and 1 point in sense, giving them overall more of a cunning and intuition focus for their overall action loads. Now, in addition to this, the player then selects any particular action on their sheet that they have 0 points in and gives it a minimum of 1 point. And then they have 3 additional points to distribute amongst their other actions, even ones that their specialty gives them, of course, up to a maximum of 3 dots. So overall, your character starts with 9 total dots of points that you can utilize for your character sheet. Next comes the number of drive points you have for each of the categories. You can see here that the journalist has 3 points in cunning, meaning that whenever they're making their dice pools, they can, at base anyway, they actually get more points here. You can actually read above my head here that they get 6 additional points that they can distribute amongst the other 2 drives. No drive having any more than 6 points at character creation. But anyway, at base, the journalist here on any cunning actions, so actions found in its category, as you can see, let's go. There's an example up here. So, for instance, nerve can be used for actions that either apply to move, strike, or control. So, that being the case, if you're playing a character that has 3 points in their nerve, they can spend 3 dice on an assignment, maybe more if they use gilded dice or have special actions to amp up those pools. One thing about this I like in particular is because you have 6 additional points that you can utilize, you are likely to invest a little bit more in your main drive. But if you have some actions in other categories, you're probably going to want to put 1 to 2 points. And actually, even better than that, there is an additional thing to consider. We have resistances, as you can see over my shoulder here. A resistance is used for a character who wants to re-roll a check based on a action they use. So for instance, if a player rolls a miss on a high stakes let's say strike, for instance, they're fighting off a character and failure might mean a grave injury for them or someone they care about, they might use a resistance point to re-roll the dice. Now, the only dice you can re-roll on a resistance check are from your base action. So any points added or any additional dice added through abilities, assistance, which I'll talk about here in a moment, or through the use of drive points are not re-rolled. So obviously having as many points in an action is very important, but even more importantly, the number of points you have in a drive gives you a resistance. For every 3 drive points you have in a particular drive, you gain a resistance. So you can see the example here. They have 4 points in their whatever drive. This looks like a nerve, and they gained a singular resistance here for it. So this is overall how your players will, or as your characters, if you're a player, will set yourselves up. Each of the particular specialties you can also see here have specific gilded actions. So that being the case, you're going to want to pick a specialty that uses an action you plan on taking the most. So if you want to be a fighting character, for instance, you're going to want to be a soldier because the soldier is always doing best when they're striking their foes. Even if you're not doing super well on a check, you can still use your gilded result to give you more drive that you can then use to do more striking. It makes a lot of sense, and it really enforces players to split up their points appropriately, but also not to neglect in filling up their categories. Essentially, you're going to want to be good at some things, so it's going to take a mandatory amount of points to be considered good at those kinds of things. And conversely, as well, if you put 0 points in a skill, I don't think I mentioned this before, but if you have 0 points in a skill and you don't add any dice to the action with drive, you will roll 2d6s and you will take the worst result, more often than not ending in a miss. So if you don't want to miss on something important, like a strike action, for instance, you're going to want to put at least 1 point into it. Now, at the start of the game, each of the player's characters will have two abilities, one from their role and one from their specialty. As you can see here by the role abilities, they tend to be a bit more on the open general side. Base characters, no matter the specialty, tend to know people or be really good in a social situation or a high pressure situation. So, for instance, I know a guy gives them an RP benefit of knowing an NPC that might have some information on their current assignment. They can use the ability once per assignment, and then the GM essentially creates an NPC that can give them some tips or information. While Sweet Talk, for instance, here gives you a +1 die on read rolls you make in which you had actually been talking to someone up until that point. So you need to make a little bit of small talk with someone, but then you get an additional die to read this individual, as you're really good at, getting to know people. Now, if your current cunning resistance is 2 or higher, that die becomes a gilded die, which can, allow you to add additional die. Now, this, of course, benefits just read rolls, but it involves your character acting in a specific way in this situation, talking a character up to gain information from them. Then we have our specialty actions. These are much more particular, and they much more lend themselves to the specific job you want your character to make. So, for instance, the doctor here, the first ability we see is patch up. And so they make a focus roll to heal one body mark, which I'll talk about marks here, on an ally. On a 4 to 5, you can spend two intuition drive points essentially to accomplish the action, and on 6 you can spend 1. So this allows you to spend drive to essentially heal an ally based on the result of a focus roll. And you even get the ability, if you miss the check, for instance, on a result of 3 or less, to take a brain mark, which is damage to your brain, which we'll talk about here in a moment, and instead take the 4 to 5 result, allowing you to then spend 2 intuition drive points. So overall, your specialty abilities are going to be a lot more mechanical and a lot more focused on your overall act, or the overall kind of things you want your character to do. And your role abilities are more based on the general actions you want your character to do. So I did mention it a little bit earlier, but let's talk about marks. So marks are the types of damages essentially your character can take during the game. Now, your character it doesn't really matter. There's no real health stats. It's not a game really designed for overly intensive mechanical things. So essentially, your character can have 3 marks without any negative consequences. But on a 4th mark, they get what's called a scar. Now, a scar changes the character irrevocably, and if a character gains 4 scars, they die. Now, there are ways to remove scars, of course, and death is not really the intent of the system. It's a narrative thing, and so a character might leave for some time, be gone for an assignment or two, to relieve one of their scars, for instance. But the 3 types of marks you can take are depending on the types of things you receive. So being shot for instance, might lead to a body mark. Well, as we saw before, the stress of the doctor ability is something that gives you a brain mark. And with the magics that I mentioned in the setting before, corrupting your body in some form or fashion, you get a bleed mark as your body becomes essentially corrupted and twisted by magical forces. Now, whenever you do take 4 marks of a particular category, your character will drop to incapacitated and they gain a scar. Now, if you do take over damage, as if something would take you to more than 4 marks, the additional marks are added as all of them are you erase the track and you take the layovers to the track again, meaning a character it can possibly, after being incapacitated, take additional marks leading to additional scars. Scars represent a deep change in the character, and this leads to some narrative thing. For instance, maybe your character suffers a terrible injury to one of their legs, giving them now a permanent limp. Now, this does not have any directly negative effects, but it does result in the character, for instance, needing to change one of their skill or one of their actions by moving a point off of the action and giving it to another action. For instance, in the case of the broken leg resulting in a limp thing that I just mentioned, you might move a point out of your move action, going from like 3 points down to 2 points, for instance, and put that remaining point into your strike or a different category, depending on what you think narratively makes sense. There is no loss, and you could say this is a lack of consequence, but it creates an interesting moment here where a character is capable of kind of shifting in a direction based on the narrative. And as I said before, when a character gets 4 scars or more, well, they or more, when they get 4 scars, they die. Now, scars can only be healed in one of two ways: either the doctor's specialty's lifesaver ability, or the character leaving Candela Obscura for an extended period of time. Now, they actually do have a lore reason for what happens here. As you can see in this section above me here in the Light Keepers and Chapter Houses mark, to protect their investigators, Candela Obscura will invite any characters who are at risk of gaining a 4th and fatal scar to instead retire and become a Light Keeper. Now, this is, of course, not necessary to retire your character. Obviously, your character can leave the organization for a time until they're ready to come back after healing a little bit. But more or less, it kind of results in a player character being retired even for a short amount of time before coming back. I do love this narrative reason for what happens to characters, and it makes it interesting because that character can come back in a later campaign as that group's Light Keeper, which I think is super cool. Now, in addition to your individual character sheets, your group actually gets a circle character sheet. Now, this character sheet, I actually don't know what it looks like because it's not included in the book. And while I could look it up, I don't think it's super important because it's very easy to identify essentially what makes a circle a circle. Now, the first and foremost thing you need to identify is what brings your circle together. Why is all the characters here? So you get these circle questions, which you can roll to on a die if you're having trouble just discussing it, or your group can discuss how they got together in general. You guys then name your circle and you choose your chapter house location. Now, your chapter house is more or less the location that is like your secret base. It is a space where not only your circle, but other circles in your chapter might get together. So it's kind of like the version of, I can't remember at this time. It was in Harry Potter, the wizard police. You know, they got into like the phone booth and they went down to a secret spot. It's that kind of thing, you know. The chapter house is really cool, but the biggest thing about the chapter house is you get a circle ability based on the benefits or the resources that your circle has gotten together. So, for instance, your circle might have a regimented stamina training regime where each assignment your group has 3 gilded dice that they can use. Any one of them can utilize to get a +1 to that roll, and that die is a gilded die. Now, this is shared amongst all members of the circle. So with 3 gilded dice, if you have 5 players, well, not everyone in that assignment is going to get access to it. So that being the case, you want to make sure that you're agreeing as a group of how you utilize these abilities. Most of these abilities, in fact, are somewhat limited. So that being the case, this really makes the group work together to make sure that you're getting the most out of your circle's ability. Now, you actually get additional abilities as your circle improves, and you gain unique resources. So these resources are Stitch, Refresh, and Train. Stitch allows you to clear all the marks off of one PC that they come back to during the mission or after the mission. Refresh allows all members, one member, sorry, to recoup all used drives and resistances. And Train allows a d6 that may be used on any roll in the next assignment. Now, these resources are extra special because, one, typically they can only be used in downtime that you guys have during in between missions, and they're very limited based on leveling up. So essentially, you get a number of points equal to, actually, it's my head's hiding it here, one plus the number of circle members. So if you have 5 players, you will get 6 resource points that you can put into your available marks here. Now, every time you put a point into one of these, you fill in the lower box with something like a pen, and then you fill in the upper boxes with pencil. This is actually the same for how you fill in your drive on your character sheet, because your maximum score doesn't typically change unless your group, levels up. And when you level up using the illumination track, which I'll mention here in a moment, you will get all those points back for your next set of missions. So that does mean that your group does need to be shrewd. And in addition, in between assignments, you can only ever use 2 resource points at a time. So that's something also to keep in mind. Overall, this makes the group have some interesting resources, in addition to the abilities that your circle provides, and it makes leveling up your circle just as big a part of your character sheet as your actual individual character. So I did mention experience. So experience in this game is essentially called illumination keys. And illumination keys are something that your group gets together. Your individual character sheets do not gain these keys, but instead they go to your illumination track, which is, I got an image of it right here. So this illumination track with 24, I counted them, little pips here indicates what you guys need to gain a level. Now, to gain these keys, you get them at the end of the assignments. Now, it does say session here, which makes me led to believe that this is kind of a, one-shot style campaigns where each assignment is supposed to be one session, but this might, again, be 2 sessions, more than likely for most groups. But at the end of the assignment, you answer one of these, or you tally up what you get. So first is you get a point if for every illumination question you answer yes to. So the illumination questions, which is right up here, is did you contain or destroy a source of bleed? Did you provide comfort or support for those affected by a phenomena? And did you bring something of importance back for Candela Obscura to protect or study? So if you answer yes to one of these, you get a point, and you can get up to 3 points if you answer yes to all of these. Now, you earn 2 points if some, but not all players fulfill their role essential actions. It's players fulfilled an illumination key action. So illumination key actions specifically here. You can see the whole list. So for instance, a journalist, because they're done by specialty, did they gather statements? Did they hunt down a lead? Did they speak truth to power? A magician would need to perform some kind of trick, spot a ruse, or seek out real magic. Let's go down to the weird ones here. So the occultist would need to consult arcane texts, collect an oddity of some variety, or act bizarre, which I'm not a big fan of that one. That just makes it likely for players to just act really weird and kind of break immersion. But, whatever it is, if some, but not all players during the course of an assignment do any list or any of these actions for their specific specialty, you gain 2 points. Now, if every player fulfilled at least one of these illumination keys during the session, then you get 4 points instead. And if none of them do it, you gain no additional illumination. So overall, with 24 points, and honestly, I think with an average, I would say, of 4 points per session. You're looking at 6 assignments per level up, which could be a lot, but obviously you can get a max of 7 points per assignment, more or less, meaning that it would take just over 3 assignments. Now, as I mentioned before, your circle has limited resources that you can utilize, some of which can refresh your character's drives, for instance. So, when you're setting up your circle and your resources, consider that each one of those points does mean something substantial for how much stamina essentially your group has, and act accordingly. Now, when the illumination track fills up, any excess will go on to the new track, and you'll gain some new advancements. Your circle will gain a new ability, and each player can choose 2 different options from the list over here. So you can either add 1 action point, add 2 drive points, take a new ability, or gild an additional action. And they do need to be different options, so you can't take 2 action points, for instance, or gain 4 drive points. So generally, what does a individual hunt looks like? Well, not only does this book provide a step-by-step, how to go through an entire assignment with a very easy to understand rubric, but it also offers 4 assignments automatically in its contents. For instance, we have the Light Eater of Bridal Born. So there's a premise to the mission, what is actually going on. So the premise is essentially what the characters know about the mission, and what is actually going on is essentially what the GM knows. Now, there's also special information like the general themes for the GM to focus on, the atmosphere to create, and the adversary that the players will come across. Not only that, but it comes with these very nice boxes here that talk about the different parts of it, the threats that the assignments might have to the players, and the notable figures that the players might have. And as well, it has a step by step of how the session should go out. So there's the hook, the players arrive on the scene, the players explore the scene, and then several escalations that occur in this section, and the climax of what the entire mission leads up to. And they also come with additional art. Now that you guys know the general gists of like the world setting and what the characters are like, how the dice work, and how everything else works, I want to talk about this book and what it offers you and your players, or you and your GM, depending on if you're a player. Now, first of all, the art is very good. You can see here, this creature's massive, by the way. We got a little like log cabin here out in the middle of nowhere. We got all these telephone wires. We got illumination, like lights, everything that was mentioned here. And we have the grotesque art of the individual being struck by lightning, it appears. All this on a kind of rugged piece of paper. This is the art that I think is very well encapsulates this kind of game. Now, this page, more specifically, I think better encapsulates the horror aspects that they want to have. This is a game about weird stuff, about body horror, about things that go bump in the night, and the things that players have to generally deal with. I think art is a very big aspect of TTRPGs, as it helps inspire both the players and the GM, and this book does not disappoint. I don't think I saw any repeated art throughout my entire review of this book, which is a pretty huge thing considering I know so many TTRPGs out there that copy paste some of their art on several of the pages to fill them out. This book has so many well done, hand drawn, non AI art that I honestly cannot recommend this book just for the art aspects alone. But it's not just art for the sake of setting the theme. In fact, this book has almost 100 pages of its 211 page count, which is including the front page and back page, that talk about the world setting. So 100 pages dedicated to locations, organizations, and the like. All of them demonstrate, or most of them demonstrate with this beautiful art for the locations, especially, And if we go through here, not only does it have a nice, short, easy to digest blurb about the location, but it also mentions a variety of points of interest. And it gives for each of these locations examples of assignments that you might come into. In addition to locations, you also have special organizations beyond Candela Obscura that your group might interact with. These sections show not only some very interesting art that we can see over here, but it shows the values of this organization, the style in which they tend to do things, the key assets. I love this part so much here because this is what this organization is about, and the notable figures in the organization that your characters might get to interact with, and possible assignments attached to them as well. This book also does include a short GM section that include a variety of extra systems to help the game beyond just the normal skill check and roll system. For instance, they have countdown dice, which if anyone is familiar with Powered by the Apocalypse, this is more or less how their clock system works, which the clock system I think even existed before Powered by the Apocalypse, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a list of additional actions. There's completion countdown for all kinds of stuff, like whole systems dedicated just for the GM. It's not a ton, but I think it's enough to get the job done, especially for a much more narrative driven game like this. And in the back of the book, you have a very nice, concise rule reference sheet that honestly I could have read and probably figured out how the game worked just by itself here. You probably saw it in some of my other cuts before for each individual area, but it goes into each of the things, gives a brief but very detailed description of how each of these things work, the marks, the scars, what the roles and specialists are, how the illumination and advancement track works, and as well a special blurb about what to do after you've, used everything that this book has available. So, we're back at the beginning, and let me give y'all my general gist of Candela Obscura. Candela Obscura is a nice rules light system that does not get a little bit too heavy in the works. I didn't even mention the gear system, but I think this video is already going to be long enough as is. Gear, if you're curious how gear works, is you get 3 pieces of gear you can utilize during the assignment, and you can use it to boost dice, give yourself gilded dice, boost all kinds of things. You know what? Get the game. Get the game and find out how gear can be used. And not only that, but the gear is not picked at the beginning of the assignment. You actually use gear as you need it, up to 3 pieces of unique gear per character. So that's pretty cool. And that kind of really emphasizes the rules like nature of the game. The game is designed to get into the narrative. It comes with a really nice book. It's really good to read. It has so many well cut out parts, and the one of the things that I really liked about Candela Obscura is the book is filled with material not for running the game as much as inspiring you to create your own stories. And that's, I think, the big part of why I am going to definitely recommend this game, because there's so many parts where you can read about an individual location in the setting, for instance, and then you get an idea based on what materials they offer you. They offer a special individual you might run into, a special site that you come across. They have assignments that they recommend, or that they kind of give as fodder for ideas for an area. This is something that is really good, especially if you're a GM who's a lot more on improv. You can just read a section and just instantly know what kind of assignment to send your players on. The character progression is neat. I wouldn't say this is the most in-depth system. It's not supposed to be, of course, but I feel like in comparison to a lot of other game systems out there, the way you can differentiate your characters from each other is actually substantial. One thing I didn't like about Blades in the Dark was, for instance, you could utilize a skill in place of another skill a lot of the time. That's not the case here at all. This system mostly just lets you use like a action for a specific action, but you could possibly use points from one drive for an action outside of that drive with special abilities. I think that's fine, and because drive is a finite resource, I think that works out really well. The system has a very nice balance of resource management, meaning that there is a nice mechanical feature to the game. Your characters are not just always going to be at max capacity or capability. You have to kind of ration yourself out, or you have to use actions that kind of fulfill your character's theme at the chance of refreshing some of those resources. So lots of risk reward, lots of action management. I think that makes it work really well to give it enough meat on its bones for players who are more rule inclined, like I am, to enjoy what is inherently a rules light system. The book in the system itself is also incredibly easy to read. I mean, characters will be ever rolling at most 6 dice. You only use d6s. And the most complicated feature of this game is gilded dice and how they replace dice rather than add dice. And sometimes they add dice that are gilded. So yeah, that's the most complicated part of the system. But more often than not, you're just gonna be using a handful of dice. You can spend some resource to add more dice, but you never roll more than 6, even with assistance. I didn't mention assistance earlier. A player can spend one point of their drive to assist another player with an action that, might be assisted by that kind of drive. So, yeah, but you can never roll more than 6 dice. So, it's overall a very easy system. The book is beautiful. It's got tons of art. It's very well laid out. It was very easy to understand. In all honesty, it took me about 4 hours to fully digest all the content in this book, which is remarkable, especially compared to some of the systems. We just started our Vampire the Masquerade campaign. You can find out on the live tab. Hopefully, it doesn't have a naked cowboy on the image anymore, but who knows? Uh, don't ask. And I'm still figuring that game out after doing a fair amount of resource. But this game, I think I could run right away if I really wanted to. It would be very easy to explain and very easy to go with it. It's very brilliantly done. The system makes sense. The art is beautiful. The world is well thought out and very thought provoking and very imaginative. And yeah, overall, as a rules light system, I'm going to rate this one a 8 out of 10. It's not perfect. There's some aspects that I think it's just limited by theme for me personally, and I think it does a lot of things well. If I had any kind of remarks, it's just some of the stuff is hard. Like you have like 9 total skills, right? And saying, oh yeah, 9 skills incorporates the entire mass of what people are capable of doing is a little hard. In some of them, like sway, for instance, the word doesn't very easily convey what it's meant to do. So there's a lot of inference made by the GM and the player to set a lot of this up. But the book does offer a lot of assistance when it comes to making interesting narratives, which I think is what is exactly needed for a rules light system. So I'm going to rate this an 8, maybe a 9, depending on if I actually get to play it and run it a little bit more. Since I haven't really played the game up until this point, this is just my review of the rules and the system and how I view it as someone who's played a lot of tabletop in the past. So it might be a 9, honestly. And as a tabletop system overall, if you're asking me if to include crunchier games, which are more my style, I would put this one at a solid 7. As well, it's good. I feel like eventually, after a few level ups, your characters are gonna start feeling kind of capped out. It's not that there's any limits to stats, but when a skill only goes up to 3 points and drives only up to 9 points, when you add 1 or 2 points every time you level, you're gonna start maxing out on a lot of the things your character wants to do in like 3 to 5 level ups in that kind of range. So I feel like you'll just kind of tap out a little early, but that's kind of rule light systems in general. So, in comparison to that market, I think it's pretty high. But as a TTRPG overall, I feel like there is kind of a limit to the amount you can play Candela Obscura, at least when it comes to like an individual character's narrative. But that's going to be it for me. Hopefully this video was informative to you and helps you decide whether you want to invest in this beautifully run system here. And well, we're a tabletop channel, so if you like this content and you want to see more like it, leave a like so other people have a chance to see it, and subscribe to get more. We also have an official Discord linked in the description where we talk all things tabletop. And as well, you'll be notified whenever I go live with our weekly tabletop chat, which we call Table Talk. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Lead the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.